Welcome, Dr. Epic here. And what we're going to do today is learn about modern American history. And to do that, we're going to do a couple interesting things. We're going to play a game about living human memory. We're going to discuss how historians interact with living memory, meet two very different Elvises, and talk about the hubris of Francis Fukuyama. There's the outline right up above my head, so put that in your notes to serve as a framework for the information that's about to follow. And we're going to start with modern American history. So, what is modern American history? Modern American history is the events of the past 150 years, generally dated from the end of the Civil War to the present day. These events largely occurred within the scope of living human memory, which makes the period much more accessible, but it also makes the period much more difficult to study. And to give you an example of this, we are going to play a game about living memory. To play this game, you'll need a couple things. You'll need a pencil, you'll need paper, and you'll need a coin. Now, you can use any coin. You can even use a digital coin. I like to use chocolate coins because they're bright, they're handsome, and at the end of the game, you can eat the coin. You can eat the coin. So we're going to create an imaginary person. A woman born in 1920 in Dallas, Texas. So the first thing you're going to do in our game is you're going to pick which of these three pictures you want to be your woman from 1920. Do you want it to be A, the kind of rebel with a cigarette, B, the brunette who likes the beach, or C, a blonde who likes cars? So there's your imaginary woman. She is born in 1920. The second thing you'll have to do is pick her name. You can pick any name you want as long as it's not stupid. All right? Here is a list of names, if you can read that. These are all sort of old fussy names from the early 20th century. Emily, Dot, Dorothy, Gloria, Abigail, Patricia, Regina. Well, I haven't met a Regina in a long time. Maggie, Matilda. Any of these names you want, you can pick. All right? So, you've picked your image for the woman you want. You've actually got her name. Now you're going to determine if she has an older or a younger brother. And this is where the coin comes in. You flip your coin. Heads, she has an older brother born in 1918. Tails, she has a younger brother born in 1922. Now, give her brother a name as well. It can be any name you want as long as it's not stupid. So her and her brother grow up in the 1920s. Warren Harding is president, and it's the 20s, the roaring 20s. Prohibition, gangsters, jazz, the Harlem Renaissance. They are little kids when all of this happens, but they are 9 years old. She is 9 years old when the Great Depression strikes. So she's going to spend her formative teenage years during the Great Depression, when the American economy imploded. Unemployment was upwards of 20, 25, 30%. Farms were devastated. The Dust Bowl formed and wiped out most of Oklahoma, Kansas, and northern Texas. Things were very, very hard. And the Great Depression hit Texas really hard. It really hit northern and east Texas very, very hard. So the question is, a lot of families did not survive the Great Depression intact. It was very hard on a lot of them. Flip your coin. Did her family disintegrate during the Great Depression? Flip your coin. If you get heads, she lucked out. Her family stayed intact, and even though they had to suffer a lot, they had to figure out how to make tomato soup using rotten tomatoes, like a lot of people did. They only had sugar once a week, but her family stayed together and stayed in Texas. But if you got tails, it's another story completely. Her family disintegrates during the Great Depression. She's forced to move elsewhere. If her family disintegrated during the Great Depression, she has to move to Los Angeles, California. Write down what happened to your woman right now. And she's there, either in Texas or in California, on December 7th, 1941, when the Empire of Japan attacks Pearl Harbor and America is thrust into the Second World War. So now you're going to figure out what happened to her family during the Second World War. Now, she's a woman, so she's not going to go serve, but her brother is. So first you have to determine, did her brother serve in Europe or in the Pacific? This is where your coin comes in again. Heads is Europe, and that's generally where most GIs wanted to go. Tails is the Pacific. The Pacific was much harsher than Europe. And off he goes to fight World War II, but did her brother make it through the Second World War? Heads, he did. Maybe with an impressive scar or two, or maybe he lost something more than that. Tails, he did not. The war ends in 1945. Now, love and marriage. She meets a handsome, dashing person, and if she's in California, she marries a serviceman in 1943 during the war, and that'll be her on the upper left. But if her family stayed intact and she stayed in Texas, she marries a successful local businessman after the war in 1950. But is it a happy marriage? Heads, it is a happy marriage. And her husband will stay married for the rest of their lives. Aw. Tails, it is not a happy marriage. And ultimately, the marriage will break up in the 1960s, and she'll do something very unusual for the 1960s. Somewhere between 1960 and 1965, you pick the year. If she has an unhappy marriage, she will divorce. Now, she gets to live through the 1950s through a period of extreme post-war affluence. The 1950s were a very good time to be in America. It was prosperous, things were good. Her and her husband, whether it's a happy or an unhappy marriage, they have 3 children. But what kind of children? If it's heads, it's 3 sons. If it's tails, it's 3 daughters. And again, you can give them any names you want, as long as the names aren't like silly, as long as they're not silly. And her family enjoyed this radical new invention that comes out in the 1950s, the television. And all sorts of new things start to come out in the 1950s, radically new shows and radical new music, including Elvis Presley. There he is, the man that popularized rock and roll. He appears on television in 1956, 1957. They intentionally tell him that he can't shake his hips, and when he does thrust with his hips, they only film him from the waist up because he's too sexy for television, Elvis. So she watches Elvis on TV, and it's your call. Based solely on your opinion, does she like Elvis? Or is she like, no. Sexy. He's too sexy for Elvis, he's too sexy for her. It's completely your decision. But write down what your decision was. Now, she is going to have a job, all right? Maybe during the war, she worked in an armaments factory or she was a waitress or something. But by the 1950s, she's going to get some kind of job. Now, if she has a happy marriage, if she won her coin flip from a while ago, one of the options she has is to just be a homemaker. Homemaker is a completely valid job. She's going to stay at home. She's going to cook. She's going to clean. She's going to raise her 3 kids. It's completely valid. There's nothing wrong with that. But if she has an unhappy marriage, she must get a job. Now, employment options in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s were not very good for women. So, if she has a happy marriage, she can pick any of these. If she has an unhappy marriage, she can't be a homemaker. But she can be a nurse, a teacher, or a secretary. Like again, wasn't a good time to be a career woman in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And one of the things she watches on television and she reads about is the great civil rights struggle of the 1950s and 60s. Martin Luther King on the National Mall. You know, she's watching on television protesters, peaceful protesters being beaten by police, having police dogs sicked on them, getting blasted with fire hoses. And one of the genius things of Martin Luther King is he preached a philosophy of passive nonviolence, which is to say they would sit and pray and bless the people, bless the policemen beating them. And the genius of Martin Luther King is he knew that these images were being recorded. They were being broadcast on television. They were being printed in the newspapers. And the more peaceful the protest, the more violent the racists, the more violent the police, the greater his victory. And the broadcast of King's speeches and the images of police brutality of the 1950s and 60s really fueled the civil rights movement. And it really engaged a lot of people who ordinarily were just not that into politics. So here is your decision about your character. Is she engaged in the civil rights struggle? Does she go out and listen to the speeches of Martin Luther King? Or does she, like a lot of people, just go, not my business, and just turn off the TV? Now it depends on whether she's in Dallas or California. If her family broke up during the Great Depression, she lives in California. But if her family didn't break up during the Great Depression, she stays in Dallas, which means she is in Dallas in 1963, watching the president's motorcade. Does she see President Kennedy die in Dallas? John F. Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas in 1963 by a deranged communist, and she might have been there to watch it happen. The Vietnam War generally lasts, the American phase of it at any rate, between 1964 and 1972. It scooped up hundreds of thousands of Americans, not just to go fight in the war, but it invigorated a massive and successful anti-war protest. And here is the question you have to determine. If your character had 3 sons, one of them goes to Vietnam. Maybe he's one of those characters right up there. But if she just had 3 daughters, it's one of her daughter's husbands who goes to Vietnam. Does he come back? Heads, he survives Vietnam. Tails, he doesn't. Flip your coin and write down what happened. Now, you have to make a decision about her other children. Does she and her other children become dirty hippies and oppose the war? Or again, do they decide they're not really going to get involved in these messy politics of the time, even though one of their sons or sons-in-law went to go fight the Vietnam War? 1969, a major accomplishment of the United States. Americans land on the moon, and it is broadcast on television. Is she there to watch the moon landing on television? Or does she have better things to do? And why are they up there anyway? It seems awful expensive. She watches on television in 1974 when the Watergate scandal consumes the presidency, forcing Richard Nixon to resign in disgrace. Now, you're not going to flip a coin for this. I just want your decision to be based on whatever you think. Does she feel bad for President Nixon resigning in disgrace from Watergate? Or does she think, no, he got what he deserved? It is now the late 1970s. She's in her late 50s. In 1979, she's 59 years old. and she experiences the great gas crises of the late 1970s, the peak of which was the gas crisis of 1979. And what happened in 1979 is that the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, principally Saudi Arabia, sought to punish the United States for its support of Israel. So they basically cut off the gas supply to the United States. And the result was a massive national gas shortage all across the United States. There was simply no gas in the gas stations. You can see that. Gas sales limited to regular customers, gas shortage, sales limited to 10 gallons of gasoline. And so if you're ever wondering why American cars went from big, powerful engines in the 1950s and 60s to itty-bitty little cars in the 1980s, it's because of the gas shortage. And our character decides she's going to get a smaller car. She's going to get rid of her old giant, Pontiac Bonneville, and she's going to get a car that gets a little better gas mileage. So she decides to get a Ford Pinto. There it is, a 1979 Ford Pinto. It's a much smaller car. Look, it's being advertised as getting 34 miles per gallon. That's actually pretty good. So she buys a Pinto. But what she didn't know, and what a lot of car buyers didn't know in 1979, was that the Pinto had a fatal engineering flaw. The Pinto had been designed in a rush. It had been designed as a response to the gas crisis. And the exhaust pipe was located just behind the gas tank. So in a rear end collision, the white hot exhaust pipe could actually be shoved into the gas tank. And the result is that in rear collisions, the Pintos were prone to explode. The cars were death traps. And the thing is that the Ford engineers had pointed this out to the company. The Ford engineers had gone to Ford Motor Company and they're like, look, this car it's a rolling death trap. You've got to redesign this car. We're going to have to postpone it for a year or two. And in one of the most infamous decisions in American, corporate history, the Ford Motor Corporation made the decision it was cheaper to pay off the people that died in Pinto explosions. It was cheaper to pay off their families and pay for their funerals than it was to recall and redesign the car. So Ford Motor Company released a car that was a rolling death trap to the public. Nobody knows how many people died in Ford Pintos, but the numbers are in the low hundreds. And our character, our woman, born in 1920, is in a Ford Pinto when it is struck behind and her Pinto explodes. Heads, she escapes without injury. Tails, she does not. So flip your coin. And if she escaped without injury, she was just very lucky. Tails, she survived, but she is crippled for the rest of her life. And perhaps she's in the hospital during the election of 1980. 1980 was one of the most controversial presidential elections in modern American history, that pitched Jimmy Carter, who argued for a small, efficient America, an America that wasn't the world power it used to be, versus Ronald Reagan, who said, no, we are going to make America great again, and America is going to be the world power that he knows it is. We're not going to flip a coin for this. I want you, based on the fun you're having with this character, to decide who she votes for in 1980. But Ronald Reagan wins the election. By the 1980s, she has adorable grandkids. How many grandkids does she have? If she lost a son or a son-in-law in Vietnam, she will have 3 grandkids. If her son or her son-in-law came back from Vietnam, she will have 6. How many grandkids does she have? You can even name them, but just don't give them stupid names. One of these grandkids is very, very interested in this crazy new invention, which starts being marketed in the early 1980s. They call it a personal computer. And one of the first personal computers is actually produced in Texas, the TRS-80. For $1,000, it has 16K of memory. Wow, 16K of memory. I think my phone has 2 gigs, which is like, I think 16 million times more powerful. But at any rate, doesn't matter. It's $1,000 back in 1980s money. I think that's about $3,500 today. So I want you to flip a coin. Heads, she buys one of her little grandkids a TRS-80. Tails, she does not. She finally retires in 1990. If she had a happy marriage, her and her husband retire. They buy a nice little house in East Texas. If she did not have a happy marriage and she divorced in the 60s, by the time she gets to the 1990s, I mean, she's what? She's 70 years old. She meets a handsome elderly gentleman and they spend the last of their lives together. But if she bought one of her grandkids a computer in the 1980s, by the 1990s, that grandchild has become a tech millionaire. So, if her grandson is a millionaire, he buys her a massive house in East Texas. But if she didn't buy a computer for her grandson, she just gets a nice, cute little house. There's nothing wrong with cute little houses. I have a cute little house. It's tiny and filthy. Yeah, I have to replace a wall. Anyway, she makes it to the 21st century and finally passes to her reward in 2007, aged 87. So you should have your little story of your Maud or your Patricia or your Isabella or your Dot or Marge. You should have an idea of the life she lived between 1920 and 2007. And here is why we've played that little game, is because modern American history is the events of the past 150 years. And when historians write about these events, they are writing about things that took place during people's lifetimes. When she reads a story or reads a history about, the Vietnam War, or one of her kids or grandkids comes back from school talking about the Vietnam War, she's going to say things like, yeah, I had a son that went to Vietnam. Or, my daughter's husband went to Vietnam. All right. When she reads about, corporations, and cars, she's going to say, yeah, I had a Ford Pinto. All right. That people have immediate lived experiences of the events that historians are talking about. Because the events that historians are writing about in modern American history occurred within the scope of living human memory, which means that you're going to have to address people's memories and perceptions of the very events that you're writing about. Because history is the study of the human past, and it makes use of the historical record. But for modern American history, people's living memories are the historical record, and everyone remembers things differently. So while modern history is very accessible, it's very easily accessible, it is also very contentious because different people remember things differently, all right? And that's why the study of modern American history tends to be quite contentious. I mean, let's take this example of history books. All of this is about modern American history, and and some of these books were published in the last few decades or so. There is Michael McClear's, monumental book on the Vietnam War, Vietnam, the 10,000-Day War. Your perception of that history is going to be very different if you had a son or a son-in-law or a daughter or someone who served in Vietnam. I mean, my uncle served in Vietnam. There's J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy about the collapse of the working class in, Virginia, West Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky. Your perception of his book is going to be very different depending on whether you are a member of sort of the hillbilly, working class, or whether you are, an urbanite of, Los Angeles or New York. your perception of that is going to be very different. Let's take Isabel Wilkerson's book on her recent book on race, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent, where she argues that basically America has an unacknowledged black-white caste system. And your perception of that modern history is going to be very different based on your race. And this is why modern American history tends to be fairly contentious, because people's perceptions, people have memory of exactly what is being written about. For example, a lot has been written about Elvis. And I like reading about music. I like reading about the history of rock and roll. And, you can't deny Elvis's place in the history of rock and roll. He popularized rock and roll. But the thing is, when I open a history book about rock and roll, I don't really recognize the Elvis that they're talking about. This is the Elvis they're talking about. Young, sexy Elvis, hip-swinging Elvis. I mean, look how sexy Elvis is over there. But that's not how I remember Elvis. I grew up in the 70s. That's the Elvis I remember. That's the Elvis I saw on TV. Fat, sweaty, pill-popping over-the-hill Elvis. Elvis who should have not been allowed on stage. That's the Elvis that pops into my brain when I read about rock and roll. Tired, over the hill, sad Elvis. That's the Elvis I remember. And people don't just write about Elvises. They write about people themselves. People write books. There are history books being written about me, about you, about the people currently wandering around modern America. How millennials became the burnout generation, about the children of the 70s and 80s, Generation X, and how these different generations of Americans fit within the larger scope of American history. William Strauss and Neil Howe's very controversial book that argues that you should see American history through the lens of generational identity. It's a very interesting book, but really contentious book. So in terms of modern American history, the job of the historian is exponentially more difficult, not just from the enormous size of the historical record that is produced by modern America, but from reconciling the academic task of building better models of the past with people's actual memories and experiences and opinions. Your opinion about Elvis is going to be really different depending on whether you were a fan in the 50s, 60s, or 70s. Although I don't know why you would be a fan of 70s Elvis. 70s Elvis was sad. He died in a bathroom. You're reading a history about the war in Afghanistan is going to be very different. If you were in Afghanistan, or if you had close relatives that were in Afghanistan. And sometimes these kind of high-minded academic ideas, sometimes they can be way, way off. And there's a great example of this in the hubris of Francis Fukuyama. There is Francis Fukuyama. Now, Francis Fukuyama, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, wrote a book, and it was published in 1992. And the name of this book was The End of History and the Last Man. And Francis Fukuyama, I believe he was at Harvard, basically proposed the following thesis. Fukuyama said, look, in 1992, the Soviet Union disintegrated. So Francis Fukuyama said, look, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, history is like over, man. Okay? That if you view history as the struggle of different ideologies, monarchy versus democracy, republicanism versus authoritarianism, socialism versus capitalism, international socialism, which is communism, versus national socialism, which is fascism, those struggle of those two ideas, if you view history as the struggle of ideas, then with the collapse of the Soviet Union, history has come to an end. We have a winner, all right? And Francis Fukuyama argued that the winner of history is liberal democracy and global capitalism. And, we're at the dawn of 100 years of peace and prosperity. Francis Fukuyama argued that, liberal democracies are the ideal form of government, and they're just very slowly going to take over the entire planet. And the countries that aren't liberal democracies will be these tiny little backwards rogue nations that people will just sort of build a wall around and ignore. And then global capitalism is going to spread across the world, and everyone is going to be affluent. History's over, and we've won. So prepare for 100 years of peace, prosperity, democracy. And Francis Fukuyama's century of peace and prosperity lasted exactly 8 years and was proven wrong in pretty much the most dramatic way that an academic can be proven wrong. With the enemies of globalism, the enemies of democracy, when Islamic terrorists kill, 3,000 people in downtown New York City. Of course, on September 11th, destroyed this idea that we are somehow at the end of history. Indeed, some people called September 11th the return of history. So why do we bother? If we can be so dramatically wrong like Fukuyama was, if we have to struggle with reconciling better models of the past with people's experiences and living memories, why do we actually bother with this whole history business at all? And for that, I'm going to return to the eminently quotable George Santayana, the great American historian. And the great American historian basically said the following, that a country without memory is a country of madmen. To know exactly who we are, we need to know how we got here. If we're in 21st century America, we need to study how America got to the 21st century. We need to understand who we are as Americans in order to build a national identity, in order to better understand the past, in order to correct, our imperfect, collective memory, and to explain why the country is the way that it is. Because the better we know our own history, the saner, the more rational, and the more American we will be. And we're going to do a great overview of our own history, all of American history, from soup to nuts, from the Ice Age to the 21st century. But we're going to do that next time. And I will see you there.
Yeah. Not bad.